April 7th, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The fuel hose disconnected from the Grumman F4F Wildcat with a metallic click as Second Lieutenant James Elms Swett settled into his cockpit, unaware that the next 15 minutes would transform him from an ordinary working man into an American legend. His hands, still calloused from years of working with marine turbines in his father's San Francisco shop, gripped the control stick with surprising steadiness for a man about to fly his very first combat mission. The radio crackled to life with words that would change everything. Condition red. Condition very red. 150 Japanese aircraft approaching from the north. Every pilot on Guadalcanal knew what that meant. The largest enemy air raid since Pearl Harbor was minutes away, and standing between those bombers and the American fleet were 76 Allied fighters scrambling desperately for altitude. Among them was a 22-year-old former industrial worker who had never fired his guns in anger, never seen an enemy aircraft except in training films, never experienced the chaos of aerial combat. What none of the Japanese pilots knew as they approached in their carefully orchestrated formations was that they were about to encounter a combination of natural talent, precise training, and pure instinct that would produce one of the most extraordinary combat performances in aviation history. James Elms Swett was born on June 15, 1920, in Seattle, Washington, the first of 3 children born to George Elms Swett and Nellie Emily Burns Swett. His father, George, was an electrical engineer and Marine Corps reservist who had founded a company manufacturing marine pumps and turbines. When James was young, the family relocated to San Mateo, California, where George established his business in the San Francisco Bay Area. The company specialized in maritime industrial equipment, the unglamorous but essential machinery that kept ships running and harbors functioning. Young James grew up in the practical realm of gears and valves, horsepower calculations and pump specifications. He attended San Mateo High School, where nothing about him suggested future heroism. After graduation in 1939, James enrolled at the College of San Mateo, the local junior college that represented the educational ceiling for most working-class families. College life offered James something unexpected. The federal government, anticipating possible war, had established the civilian pilot training program to create a reserve of trained pilots. The program subsidized flight training for college students. James seized the opportunity with enthusiasm. Flying came naturally to him. The same mechanical intuition that helped him understand pump systems translated seamlessly to aircraft operation. He soloed quickly, progressed rapidly, and by the time he completed the civilian program had accumulated 450 hours of flight time. That number would prove crucial. Most naval aviation cadets received far less flying time during their training. James arrived at military flight school with more experience than many instructors. The world situation deteriorated throughout 1940 and early 1941. Europe burned under Nazi conquest. Japan expanded aggressively through Asia. On August 26, 1941, James Elms Swett enlisted in the United States Naval Reserve as a seaman second class and began flight training in September. He was 21 years old, leaving behind the comfortable certainty of his father's business for the unknown challenges of military aviation. Flight training at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, Texas, revealed what the civilian pilot training program had suggested. James Swett possessed natural flying ability combined with exceptional discipline. He completed training in early 1942, placing in the top 10% of his class. That ranking gave him a choice most cadets never received. He could accept a commission in the Navy or transfer to the Marine Corps. James chose the Marines. On April 1, 1942, exactly 1 year before his famous mission, Second Lieutenant James Elms Swett received his commission and his gold wings as a naval aviator. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, weighed 154 pounds, had brown hair and blue eyes. Nothing about his appearance suggested the warrior he would become. Advanced training followed at Quantico, Virginia, then carrier qualification aboard the USS Wolverine on Lake Michigan, and finally tactical training in San Diego, California. The Marines were preparing pilots for the brutal aerial combat of the Pacific Theater. The training emphasized survival as much as victory. Stay fast, dive away, never turn with a zero, use your wingman, conserve ammunition, aim carefully. The lessons were taught by instructors who had survived the early disasters at Pearl Harbor and Wake Island. They knew what worked and what got you killed. In March 1943, Second Lieutenant Swett shipped out to the Southwest Pacific aboard the escort carrier USS Nassau. The journey took weeks, first to Hawaii for tactics training, then onward to the combat zone. Veterans told stories of relentless Japanese attacks, of pilots flying 4 missions per day, of losses so severe that entire squadrons were wiped out in weeks. When VMF 221 arrived at Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides in late March, the pilots received their final briefing before deploying forward. Swett was assigned to Marine Fighting Squadron 221, VMF 221, part of Marine Air Group 21, 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. The squadron had earned its reputation defending Wake Island in December 1941, where 4 Wildcats and their pilots had fought heroically against overwhelming Japanese forces. Now reconstituted with new pilots and aircraft, VMF 221 flew from Espiritu Santo to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal to join the ongoing air campaign. Henderson Field represented American determination. Built initially by Japanese construction crews in July 1942, it had been captured by the 1st Marine Division on August 7th and defended against relentless Japanese attacks for 8 months. The airfield remained crude by any standard. A single runway of pierced steel planking, revetments constructed from sandbags and palm logs, tents for maintenance facilities. Rain turned the area into a swamp. Heat and humidity were oppressive. Malaria was endemic. Yet Henderson Field was arguably the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific War. Allied aircraft operating from Henderson commanded the waters around Guadalcanal and prevented Japanese reinforcement. Control of Henderson meant control of the Solomon Islands. Control of the Solomons meant securing the supply line to Australia. Everything depended on that single muddy runway and the men who flew from it. James Swett spent his first weeks on Guadalcanal learning combat operations without actually engaging the enemy. VMF 221 flew patrols constantly, but Swett's division never made contact. He flew routine missions, gained familiarity with his aircraft, developed chemistry with his fellow pilots, and waited. The waiting ended in early April 1943, when Allied intelligence detected ominous Japanese preparations. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed massive concentrations of enemy planes at Rabaul, Bougainville, Kahili, and Balale. Japanese radio traffic increased dramatically. What the Americans were detecting was Operation Waigo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's aerial counter-offensive designed to halt Allied advances. Yamamoto had gathered nearly 350 aircraft for the operation, stripping fighters and dive bombers from 4 aircraft carriers to supplement land-based air forces. The first major attack was scheduled for April 7, 1943, targeting ships and aircraft at Guadalcanal. Yamamoto committed 67 Aichi D3A dive bombers, code-named Val by the Allies, escorted by 110 Mitsubishi A 6M0 fighters. The formation totaled 177 aircraft, launched from bases over 400 miles to the northwest. The raid was organized into 6 elements. 2 fighter sweeps would arrive first, then 4 waves of dive bombers would attack in carefully timed sequence. Japanese commanders anticipated significant success. American intelligence had detected the build-up, but could not predict exact timing. Coast watchers, brave Australian and New Zealand observers hidden on Japanese-controlled islands, provided early warning. On the morning of April 7th, reconnaissance aircraft detected activity suggesting an imminent raid, At 12:26 p.m., Coast Watcher reports of the approaching formation reached Guadalcanal. By 2 p.m., with the raid imminent, Henderson Field broadcast condition red. Every available fighter was prepared for launch. At noon, Second Lieutenant James Swett led his division of 4 Grumman F4F Wildcats on a routine combat air patrol over the Russell Islands, 30 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The patrol proved uneventful. After 2 hours aloft, with fuel running low and no enemy contact, Swett led his division back to Henderson Field. They landed at approximately 2 p.m. and taxied to the revetments. Ground crews immediately began hand-pumping aviation fuel into the Wildcat's tanks. Each aircraft required 117 gallons. The process would take at least 30 minutes. Swett climbed down from his cockpit, stretched his cramped legs, and prepared to wait. Then everything changed. The operations officer made an instant decision. Launch everything. Partially fueled aircraft were better than aircraft caught on the ground. Swett was still standing beside his Wildcat, Bureau number 12084, when the alert sounded. Ground crews shouted at him to mount up. The fuel hose was yanked from his wing tank, spilling precious gasoline on the pierced steel planking. Around him, 76 Allied fighters were scrambling for altitude. 36 F4F Wildcats from Marine squadrons, 9 F4U Corsairs, 6 P-40 Warhawks, 12 P-38 Lightnings, and 13 P-39 Airacobras. Every fighter within range was being thrown into the air to face the approaching Japanese armada. The Wildcat that Swett flew represented America's first-generation carrier fighter, already obsolescent but still deadly in capable hands. The F4F4 variant carried 650 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing with 240 rounds per gun. Total ammunition load was 1,440 rounds, translating to approximately 18 to 20 seconds of sustained fire. The Wildcat's limitations were well known: maximum speed of 318 miles per hour at 19,000 feet, climb rate of approximately 1,900 feet per minute under ideal conditions, though combat-loaded aircraft climbed slower, turn radius inferior to Japanese fighters, range limited to 700 miles. The aircraft was slower and less maneuverable than its primary opponent in almost every performance category. What the Wildcat possessed was durability and firepower. The airframe could absorb tremendous battle damage and continue flying. The 50 caliber machine guns hit far harder than lighter weapons carried by Japanese fighters. American pilots had learned to use these advantages through tactics emphasizing diving attacks, mutual support, and disengagement, rather than sustained turning dogfights. Swett advanced his throttle and felt the Pratt & Whitney R1830-86 twin Wasp engine roar to full power. 1,200 horsepower drove the 3-bladed propeller, pulling the Wildcat forward. The fighter accelerated slowly, heavily loaded with fuel and ammunition. It required every foot of the short runway to gain flying speed. At 70 miles per hour, Swett pulled back on the stick and the Wildcat lifted reluctantly into the air. He raised his landing gear by hand, cranking the retraction handle 30 times to fold the wheels into their wing recesses. The process required his right hand off the throttle for nearly 30 seconds, while his left hand flew the aircraft. It was an exhausting procedure during the critical moment after takeoff, but every Wildcat pilot had done it hundreds of times. Once airborne, Swett joined with his 3 wingmen and began the desperate climb for altitude. Japanese dive bombers would approach at 15 to 20,000 feet. American fighters needed to reach that altitude or higher. The Wildcat climbed slowly, painfully slowly for pilots who knew the enemy was approaching at 300 miles per hour. At approximately 1,800 feet per minute in combat conditions, reaching 15,000 feet required nearly 9 minutes. Around Swett, the sky filled with climbing American fighters, all clawing for altitude, all racing against time. Below him, Swett could see the waters north of Guadalcanal. Tulagi Harbor contained American ships. 3 cruisers, several destroyers, cargo vessels, tankers, and auxiliaries. Thousands of American sailors, unaware that 177 Japanese aircraft were approaching to destroy them. The radio net crackled with reports. Coast watchers tracking the raid, fighter directors coordinating the intercept, pilots reporting positions and altitudes. The controlled chaos of aerial warfare in 1943, before sophisticated radar, before modern command and control, when everything depended on visual sighting and voice radio. At approximately 2:15 p.m., at 14,000 feet altitude over the Russell Islands, Swett spotted them. Dark specks against the blue sky to the northwest, growing rapidly larger. Dozens of aircraft in tight formation. More than Swett had ever seen. More than he had imagined possible. The entire Japanese raid stretching across miles of sky, organized into precise elements, approaching with terrifying determination. Swett keyed his radio microphone. "Tally-ho, bandits 12 o'clock high, multiple bogies." His voice was steady, showing none of the fear that clenched his stomach. Fighter director acknowledged. "All fighters engage." Good hunting. That was it. No elaborate tactics, no careful coordination. Just engage. 76 American fighters against 177 Japanese aircraft. Swett rolled his Wildcat into a steep diving turn, positioning for an attack on the dive bombers. His wingmen followed, maintaining formation discipline despite the chaos erupting around them. Below and ahead, he could see the Aichi D3A Val dive bombers in neat formations. The Vals were single-engine aircraft, each carrying a crew of 2 and 1,000-pound bomb. They were obsolescent, slow and vulnerable, but deadly if they reached their targets. Swett selected 3 Vals that had separated slightly from the main formation. He positioned his division above and behind them, setting up for a classic overhead diving attack. The Japanese rear gunners would see him coming but would have difficulty tracking a target diving at high speed. At 350 miles per hour, Swett pulled out of his dive directly behind the trailing Val. The Japanese aircraft filled his gun sight, growing from a small silhouette to a clearly defined target in seconds. Range closed to 200 yards, 150 yards, 100 yards. Swett pressed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. The sound was deafening even through his leather helmet. The Wildcat shuddered from recoil. Tracers reached out toward the Val. The first burst struck the Val's fuselage and left wing. Pieces of metal tore away from the Japanese bomber. The rear gunner stopped firing. The Val began smoking, then burning, then exploded in mid-air. First kill. Swett had no time to think, no time to celebrate. He was already lining up the second Val, which was desperately trying to evade. The Japanese pilot dove toward the water. Swett followed, keeping his Wildcat positioned behind and slightly above, firing short, precise bursts. The second Val caught fire and went down. 2 kills in less than 30 seconds. Swett pulled up hard, looking for the third Val. The Japanese pilot had seen his companions destroyed and was attempting to escape. Swett climbed after him, using energy from his dive to maintain pursuit. The Val was slow, barely 200 miles per hour in level flight. The Wildcat closed steadily. At 100 yards, Swett fired a long burst. The Val exploded, raining debris into the ocean below. 3 enemy aircraft destroyed in his first 90 seconds of combat. 3 bombers that would never reach American ships. But Swett had become separated from his division during the attack. His wingmen had engaged different targets and were now scattered across the sky. He found himself alone in the middle of the largest air battle in the Pacific War to date. As Swett climbed back toward the main engagement, American anti-aircraft fire from the ships below opened up on everything in the sky. The gunners could not distinguish between American and Japanese aircraft at altitude. They fired at everything that moved, filling the air with exploding shells and shrapnel. A burst of anti-aircraft fire detonated near Swett's left wing. Shrapnel punctured the wing surface and damaged the aileron. The Wildcat suddenly became harder to control, requiring constant pressure on the stick to maintain level flight. A less experienced pilot might have disengaged. Swett checked his instruments. Oil pressure steady, engine temperature normal, flight controls still responding despite the wing damage. He was still combat capable. The decision took seconds. He would continue fighting. Ahead and below, Swett spotted a formation of 6 more Vals approaching Tulagi Harbour for their attack run. These bombers were flying in loose line astern formation, following each other toward the target. They had been separated from their fighter escort by the ferocious American interception and now flew unprotected. Swett dove on them. The Japanese pilots never saw him coming. Diving from above and behind, with the sun at his back, Swett approached the last bomber in the line. He closed to less than 100 yards before opening fire. The Val exploded instantly, its bomb detonating from the gunfire. Swett flew through the debris cloud, his windscreen temporarily obscured by smoke and fragments. He pulled up slightly, acquired the next target, fired another burst. The second Val burst into flames and fell away. Swett worked his way up the line methodically, firing short controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, making every bullet count. Each Val he destroyed was one less bomb falling on American ships. The fourth Val took more hits to destroy. Swett's ammunition was running low and his bursts were shorter. He closed to less than 50 yards, close enough to see the Japanese rear gunner firing desperately at him, close enough to see the terrified face of the pilot. Swett fired until the Val caught fire and fell toward the ocean. 4 more kills, bringing his total to 7 enemy aircraft destroyed. Swett was now officially an ace, having achieved 5 or more aerial victories in a single combat lasting approximately 15 minutes. It was an almost unprecedented achievement, but Swett was not finished. Ahead, he spotted 1 more Val attempting to reach the ships. The Japanese pilot was flying at wave-top altitude. Swett dove after him, his damaged Wildcat responding sluggishly to control inputs. He closed on the Val from behind and above, lined up the shot and pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. His guns were empty. 1,440 rounds of ammunition expended in approximately 15 minutes of combat. But now he faced an enemy bomber with no ammunition remaining. Most pilots would have disengaged at this point. Without ammunition, a fighter was defenseless. The tactically sound decision was to return to base, rearm, and rejoin the battle. James Swett made a different choice. He continued his attack on the Val, despite having no ammunition, flying directly at the Japanese bomber in an attempt to intimidate the pilot into breaking off his attack run. The Val's rear gunner was not intimidated. He fired burst after burst at the approaching Wildcat. Bullets struck Swett's aircraft repeatedly. The windscreen shattered from multiple hits. Glass fragments slashed across Swett's face, cutting his cheek and forehead. Blood ran down into his eyes, partially blinding him. His engine began making rough sounds as Japanese bullets found critical components. Oil pressure began dropping. Temperature began rising. The oil cooler had been hit, damaged by the Val's defensive fire. The Pratt & Whitney engine that had performed flawlessly throughout the mission was dying. Swett broke off the attack and turned toward Henderson Field, hoping to make it back before his engine seized. The Wildcat shuddered and bucked as the engine misfired. Black smoke streamed from the cowling. Oil covered his windscreen, further reducing visibility already compromised by blood and the shattered canopy. He was 15 miles from Henderson Field, flying a heavily damaged aircraft, bleeding from facial wounds, with an engine that could fail completely at any second. Below him was Tulagi Harbour and Florida Island. If his engine failed, he would have to ditch in the water. Ditching near the harbour meant he might be rescued quickly. Ditching in the open ocean meant probable death. The engine made the decision for him. With a grinding shriek of metal on metal, the Pratt & Whitney seized. The propeller stopped and the Wildcat became a glider. Swett had perhaps 2 minutes of flight time remaining before he would hit the water. He trimmed the aircraft for best glide speed, approximately 110 miles per hour, and looked for a suitable ditching location. The water near Florida Island looked reasonably calm. No large waves visible. If he could execute a proper ditching, if the Wildcat didn't cartwheel or break apart on impact, he might survive. The final seconds before impact required perfect technique. Swett lowered his landing gear manually to act as a water brake. He opened his canopy to ensure he could exit quickly. He tightened his shoulder harness to prevent being thrown forward on impact. Then he prepared to fly the aircraft into the water at precisely the correct angle and speed. Too steep and the Wildcat would nose under. Too shallow and it would skip and tumble. The correct angle was perhaps 5 degrees nose up, touching down at minimum controlled airspeed. At 50 feet altitude, Swett pulled back slightly on the stick, bleeding off the last excess speed. 40 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet. The Wildcat's tail touched water first, exactly as intended. The aircraft decelerated violently as drag increased. Swett was thrown forward against his shoulder straps with crushing force despite having them tightened. His face smashed into the instrument panel, breaking his nose with an audible crack. Pain exploded across his face. The Wildcat settled into the water and immediately began sinking. The heavy engine pulled the nose down. Water rushed into the cockpit through the open canopy. Swett needed to exit the aircraft within seconds, or he would be dragged down with it. He reached for his seatbelt buckle with fingers slippery with blood. The buckle released. He pushed himself upward out of the seat. His parachute harness caught on something inside the cockpit. He was trapped. Water was rising rapidly in the cockpit, already up to his chest. Cold seawater mixed with blood from his facial wounds, stinging and burning. Swett yanked desperately at the parachute harness, trying to free himself. The harness remained caught. The Wildcat was sinking faster now, pulling him down. Water reached his chin, his mouth, his nose. He was under water, still trapped in the sinking fighter, drowning in 10 feet of water after surviving 15 minutes of intense aerial combat. His lungs burned for air. His vision began to darken. Swett gave one final desperate heave, pulling with every ounce of strength remaining. The parachute harness tore free. He pushed himself up and out of the cockpit, swimming desperately toward the surface he could no longer see. His life vest should have inflated automatically, but had not, perhaps damaged by shrapnel, perhaps fouled by the parachute harness. He could not reach the surface. His lungs were empty. His muscles were failing. Then, miraculously, his life vest inflated. The compressed gas cartridge that had failed initially suddenly activated. The vest expanded instantly, providing buoyancy that rocketed Swett toward the surface. He broke the surface gasping and choking, sucking in air with desperate heaves. Blood and seawater ran down his face. His nose throbbed with agonizing pain. His face burned from the lacerations. His chest ached from the impact against his harness. But he was alive. He had survived. Around him, the air battle continued. Aircraft dove and climbed overhead. Guns chattered. Bombs exploded in the harbour. Ships fired anti-aircraft weapons in continuous barrage. Within 15 minutes of Swett reaching the surface, a Coast Guard rescue boat spotted him floating in his life vest. The crew pulled him aboard, gave him morphine for the pain, and treated his wounds as best they could with combat first aid supplies. Someone handed him a bottle of Scotch whisky. He drank gratefully, feeling the alcohol burn down his throat, warming his shocked system. The Coast Guard boat delivered him to Tulagi Harbour, where he was transferred to the Naval Hospital at Guadalcanal. Doctors examined him, cleaned and stitched his facial lacerations, set his broken nose, checked for internal injuries. Remarkably, aside from the facial wounds and nose fracture, Swett was essentially unhurt. No broken bones except the nose, no internal damage initially detected. The morphine dulled the pain to a manageable level. After treatment and initial recovery at the Naval Hospital over the following days, Swett received visits from squadron mates and intelligence officers. Multiple witnesses had observed his attacks on the VAL formations. Other pilots confirmed seeing his repeated diving attacks. Anti-aircraft crews on the ships had watched his sustained assault on the enemy bombers. The intelligence officer's assessment was unequivocal. Second Lieutenant James Elms Swett had destroyed 7 enemy aircraft confirmed in his first combat mission. The assessment made Swett an instant ace, one of the rare ace-in-a-day pilots. More importantly, Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Naval Aviation Forces in the South Pacific, personally nominated Swett for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation would proceed through channels, but Mitcher's nominations were rarely rejected. After recovering sufficiently, Swett returned to VMF 221 and resumed flying operations. The squadron was converting from F4F Wildcats to the newer F4U Corsair, a significantly more capable fighter. Swett checked out in the Corsair during a brief rest period in Australia and returned to the Russell Islands in May. On June 30th, 1943, now promoted to First Lieutenant, Swett provided air cover for the Allied landings at Rendova Island. During that mission, he shot down 2 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty medium bombers and shared credit for destroying a Zero fighter with another pilot. 11 days later, on July 11th near New Georgia Island, Swett shot down 2 more Bettys while defending his wingman from attacking Zeros. He then destroyed a Zero pursuing his wingman's Corsair, preventing what would have been a certain kill. But Swett failed to see a second Zero positioning behind him. The Japanese pilot's cannon fire struck Swett's Corsair, damaging the engine and fuel system. For the second time in 3 months, James Swett found himself attempting an emergency landing. This time there was no Coast Guard boat nearby. He was over open water far from friendly forces, with an engine losing power and leaking fuel. He managed to ditch the Corsair successfully, exiting the cockpit without major injury, and inflated his life raft. He floated alone in enemy-controlled waters, hoping for rescue before Japanese forces found him. 2 local Solomon Islanders in a small canoe spotted Swett several hours later. They were native islanders who served as scouts for Australian coast watchers. The islanders pulled Swett into their canoe and paddled him to their village. From there, he was transported by a larger 10-man canoe for several hours to reach an Australian coast watcher's station hidden in the jungle. The coast watcher, an Australian serviceman living behind Japanese lines and radioing intelligence to Allied forces, coordinated with Allied command for Swett's evacuation. A PBY Catalina flying boat landed in a sheltered bay the next day and retrieved Swett. He was returned to the Russell Islands exhausted but uninjured. The Coast Watcher network and local islanders had saved countless Allied lives during the Pacific War. Swett owed his life to their courage. The islanders received compensation of $14 worth of calico cloth and canned beef, modest payment that Swett later said was inadequate recognition for saving his life. In October 1943, Swett flew missions over Bougainville, engaging Japanese aircraft defending the major airbase at Kahili. He shot down 1 Zero confirmed and damaged another probable kill. In November, he added 2 more Valdive bombers to his tally. He also engaged a Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony fighter, though intelligence officers could only confirm it as probable rather than confirmed destruction. By December 1943, James Swett had flown 103 combat missions and accumulated 15.5 confirmed aerial victories. He was 23 years old. On October 10, 1943, while Swett was still in the combat zone, Major General Ralph Johnson Mitchell, commanding the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, presented First Lieutenant James Elms Swett with the Medal of Honor at a ceremony held at Espiritu Santo. The citation recognized his extraordinary heroism on April 7, 1943, when he unhesitatingly led his division against a superior force of enemy bombers, personally destroyed 3 aircraft during his initial dive, then boldly attacked 6 additional enemy bombers after being separated from his division, shooting down 4 more despite heavy anti-aircraft fire and return fire from the bombers that damaged his aircraft, shattered his windscreen, and wounded him before he successfully ditched his fighter in the water off Tulagi. The Marine Corps decided Swett needed rest. He departed the combat zone on December 11, 1943, and arrived in San Francisco on December 31st. He was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station Santa Barbara, California, to train new pilots preparing for Pacific deployment. In spring 1944, First Lieutenant Swett traveled to Washington and met President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the White House during a ceremony honoring Medal of Honor recipients. Roosevelt, who had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, asked informed questions about the Corsair and combat tactics. Swett found the President genuinely interested. The meeting lasted 20 minutes, far longer than scheduled, because Roosevelt kept asking follow-up questions about Pacific air combat. By late 1944, Swett was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro, California, where VMF 221 was training for Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945. The squadron was equipped with F4U4 Corsairs and assigned to provide close air support for landing forces. Every pilot knew Operation Olympic would be the bloodiest campaign in history. Then, in August 1945, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. Operation Olympic was cancelled. VMF 221 had ended the war ranked second among all Marine squadrons, with 185 confirmed aerial victories. After the war, Swett commanded Marine Fighting Squadron 141 Flying Corsairs at Naval Air Station Alameda, California. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, VMF 141 was deployed to Korea. But Swett was left behind. The Navy had made a policy decision that Medal of Honor recipients were too valuable to risk in combat. Swett protested vigorously, arguing that he should lead his squadron. The Navy was unmoved. Frustrated, Swett left active duty around 1950 and continued service in the Marine Corps Reserve. He would eventually retire in 1970 with the rank of colonel, having served 29 years. Swett returned to San Francisco and went to work in his father's company manufacturing marine pumps and turbines. The business James Elms Swett had founded in 1920 was still operating, still building the essential machinery that kept maritime industry functioning. James, now Colonel Swett in the reserves, returned to the machine shop he had left 12 years earlier. The calluses on his hands, worn smooth during his years of flying, gradually returned as he worked with pumps and valves and turbines. In 1960, George Swett died, and James inherited the company. For the next 23 years, he ran the business his father had built, maintaining the same commitment to quality engineering that had sustained the company through the Depression and war years. He eventually passed the business to his son, continuing the family tradition. The pump company remained modest but profitable, providing steady employment and reliable products. Swett moved to Trinity Center, California in retirement, later relocating to Redding. He became a frequent speaker at schools, where he shared not combat stories, but rather his beliefs about personal values, respect, responsibility, and citizenship. He talked about the importance of doing your job well, supporting your teammates, and maintaining your equipment properly. He rarely discussed killing enemy pilots. When students asked about combat, he emphasized teamwork and training rather than individual heroics. His message focused on duty, preparation, and collective effort. In 2006, the History Channel produced an episode of their series Dogfights recreating Swett's April 7, 1943 mission using computer graphics. Swett provided commentary for the episode, describing his actions with the same matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing mechanical engineering. The episode aired on November 24, 2006, and introduced Swett's story to a new generation. Younger viewers found it difficult to reconcile the elderly man speaking calmly about the mission with the intense computer-generated combat they watched on screen. But that was precisely who James Swett had been throughout his life. A man who did extraordinary things without considering them extraordinary. On January 18, 2009, Colonel James Elms Swett died in a Reading hospital from heart failure after a lengthy illness. He was 88 years old. He was survived by his family, his legacy, and the memory of 15 minutes that had transformed an industrial worker into a legend. He was buried with full military honors at Northern California Veterans Cemetery in Igo, California. The funeral was attended by hundreds, including surviving members of VMF 221, fellow Medal of Honor recipients, and representatives from the Marine Corps and Navy. Fighter aircraft performed a missing man formation flyover. A Marine Honor Guard fired a 21-gun salute. Taps echoed across the cemetery grounds. The American flag that had draped his coffin was folded with military precision and presented to his family. The story of James Elms Swett illuminates profound truths about heroism and the character of the men who won World War II. Swett was not a professional warrior descended from military tradition or educated at elite academies. He was a working-class young man from the San Francisco Bay Area who happened to possess natural flying ability and unshakable courage. His story was replicated thousands of times across the Pacific Theater. Farmers became tank commanders, shopkeepers became bombardiers, factory workers became submariners. America took ordinary citizens and transformed them into a military force that defeated professional armies that had trained for decades. The transformation was systematic and thorough, based on principles America understood instinctively. Provide excellent training. Supply the best equipment possible. Trust individuals to make decisions. Reward initiative and aggressive action. These principles, anathema to authoritarian military systems, produced combat effectiveness that totalitarian regimes could not match. The American military system produced thousands of skilled pilots and soldiers who performed at levels enemy commanders considered impossible. James Swett shot down 7 Japanese aircraft on his first mission, not because he was superhuman, but because he was superbly trained, adequately equipped, and trusted to use his initiative. The decision to press an attack without ammunition was his alone, made in seconds, based on training and instinct. This individual initiative, this assumption of personal responsibility without requiring permission, characterized American combat effectiveness throughout the war. Technology and training created opportunities for victory, but individual courage remained essential. Comparing production statistics reveals the industrial disparity that shaped the Pacific War's outcome. During World War II, the United States produced approximately 324,000 aircraft of all types. Germany produced approximately 94,000 aircraft total. Japan produced approximately 76,000 combat aircraft. American aircraft production exceeded the combined Axis total substantially, but numbers alone understate American advantages. American aircraft were generally more durable, carried more ammunition, possessed better equipment, and were maintained by better-trained ground crews supplied with unlimited spare parts. An F4F Wildcat destroyed in combat was replaced within days. A Japanese Zero destroyed might not be replaced for months due to production bottlenecks and material shortages. American pilot training similarly emphasized quality over quantity. The United States trained approximately 193,000 pilots during World War II from over 317,000 cadets who entered training. Washout rates remained above 39% even during pilot shortages. The system prioritized quality, understanding that poorly trained pilots died quickly without achieving objectives. Japan was forced to reduce training standards as losses mounted. By 1944, Japanese pilots entered combat with less than 100 hours total flight time, compared to Swett's 450 hours before enlistment, plus extensive military training. Japanese pilots died in their first missions, unable to survive against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft. This created a death spiral where Japan's experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be trained, leading to declining pilot quality, higher losses, and accelerated decline. America continuously produced well-trained, confident pilots flying increasingly superior aircraft, backed by unlimited logistics. Yet even with these advantages, men like James Swett still had to face enemy fire and risk death. Courage alone was insufficient, but remained essential. The America that James Swett returned to after the war had been transformed by total mobilization. The economy had exploded from depression stagnation to full employment and booming production. New industries had been created virtually overnight. The nation had discovered capabilities it had not known it possessed. This transformation was particularly evident to combat veterans returning from overseas. They had witnessed American military power abroad and now returned to see American economic power at home, creating unprecedented prosperity. The two were connected. The same industrial capacity that built aircraft could build automobiles. The same organizational skills that coordinated military logistics could coordinate domestic supply chains. The same engineering expertise that designed weapons could design consumer products. America was poised to dominate the post-war world through economic productivity. The pump company Swett operated exemplified this. Small-scale, locally owned, technically sophisticated, reliably profitable. Thousands of such companies across America produced components and equipment that sustained the economy. They were not glamorous, but they were essential. Swett's decision to return to his father's business reflected his values. He had never sought fame. The Medal of Honor was appreciated but not defining. What mattered was doing useful work, providing for family, contributing to community. These modest aspirations characterized millions of World War II veterans who returned home and quietly built post-war prosperity. They went back to work, raised families, paid taxes, and participated in civic life without demanding special treatment. The greatest generation earned its title not through combat heroism alone, but through the collective decision to build rather than complain, to contribute rather than demand, to focus on the future rather than dwell on the past. Swett's school speeches emphasized values more than combat. He told students that success came from preparation and hard work, that security came from competence, that respect came from responsibility. He rarely mentioned killing enemy pilots except when directly asked. There was no glorification of violence, no triumphalism, no hatred of former enemies. By the 1980s, American attitudes toward World War II had evolved. The war was increasingly seen as morally unambiguous, clearly justified, successfully concluded. Veterans were honored as heroes, their service appreciated, their sacrifices recognized. This represented significant change from earlier decades when World War II was taken for granted, overshadowed by Korea and Vietnam. Colonel James Swett's funeral in 2009 brought closure to a life spanning nearly 9 decades, witnessing America's transformation from Depression uncertainty to 21st century superpower status. Swett was born in 1920 when the United States was still recovering from World War I. He died in 2009 when America was the unquestioned global hegemon. That transformation required the efforts of millions, but men like Swett had been essential contributors. His 15 minutes of combat on April 7, 1943, represented a tiny fraction of the vast American war effort, yet thousands of similar actions collectively overwhelmed Japanese forces. They faced not just skilled pilots, but an entire system designed to produce skilled pilots continuously, supply them with excellent aircraft constantly, support them with logistics unfailingly. The system enabled heroism, but did not create it. James Swett's decision to continue attacking without ammunition was individual choice, not systematic programming. His survival of ditching was personal resilience, not organizational design. His decades of post-war service were character traits developed through upbringing, not learned military behaviors. The system provided opportunity. Swett provided courage and competence. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient alone. The story of James Elms Swett resonates across generations because it embodies values, Americans recognize as fundamentally their own. Individual initiative rather than blind obedience. Personal responsibility rather than dependence on authority. Technical competence valued over social status. Humble service rather than self-promotion. Quiet courage rather than bombast. Swett represented millions of ordinary Americans who accomplished extraordinary things when circumstances demanded. He insisted he had simply done his job. But in doing that job superbly, he and thousands like him defeated powerful enemies, defended civilization, and created foundations for decades of peace and prosperity. The America Swett defended in 1943 was imperfect, with significant domestic problems including racial segregation and economic inequality. But it also represented hope for oppressed peoples worldwide, offered opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth, and combined individual liberty with collective purpose more successfully than previous societies. The fact that a working man could become a fighter ace, earn the nation's highest military decoration, then return home to run his father's business without ceremony, illustrated the egalitarian character distinguishing America from class-bound societies and totalitarian powers. James Swett never sought to become a symbol. He would have preferred to remain anonymous, another pilot doing his part without recognition. But history thrust symbolism upon him. His Medal of Honor made him a public figure. His extraordinary first mission made him a legend. His humble post-war life made him a model. Accepting these roles with grace became another form of service. When the History Channel asked him to participate in recreating his combat mission, Swett could have declined. Instead, he participated fully, providing detailed information, ensuring accuracy, because he believed younger generations should understand what their predecessors accomplished. On a hillside in Northern California, a gravestone marks Colonel James Elms Swett's resting place. The stone lists his name, rank, dates, and the Medal of Honor. It does not detail his achievements. The stone is simple, dignified. Nearby rest other veterans. Some died in combat. Some lived long lives. All served. The cemetery represents equality in death, where all rest together without distinction. James Swett would have appreciated that equality. He never sought special treatment, never demanded recognition based on decorations. The values Swett lived by were simple. Do your job well. Support your teammates. Maintain your equipment. Accept responsibility. Honor your commitments. These were working-class values, learned in machine shops and applied in combat and business with equal validity. They were practical and proven. 88 years after his birth in Seattle, 66 years after his 15 minutes over Guadalcanal, James Elms Swett's life ended. His story survives because it matters. Not because it was unique, but because it was typical. Thousands of young Americans like James Swett answered their nation's call, performed beyond expectation, and returned home without demanding special recognition. They built post-war prosperity, raised families, contributed to communities. Their collective achievement was monumental. Their individual modesty was remarkable. The combination defined a generation. The final lesson of James Swett's life is simple. Ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when preparation meets opportunity and courage. Swett was not superhuman. He was trained, equipped, and motivated. The system prepared him. The situation challenged him. His character sustained him. The results were extraordinary, but the process was comprehensible. Any young person with similar training, equipment, and character might achieve similar results. That was the real secret of American success. Not superior humans, but superior systems. Not natural warriors, but trained soldiers properly equipped. Not innate advantages, but developed capabilities. The formula was repeatable and sustainable. It produced victory in World War II and continued producing success in subsequent challenges. James Elms Swett died in 2009 as the last members of the greatest generation gradually departed. His passing marked the end of one man's journey, but the continuation of values he embodied: courage and humility, competence and modesty, service and citizenship. These values remain as relevant today as in 1943. Technology changes, threats evolve, challenges differ, but fundamental character traits that enabled Swett's generation to triumph remain timeless. In recognizing James Swett's achievements, we honor an entire generation. In studying his life, we learn lessons applicable to our times. In preserving his memory, we ensure future generations understand what their predecessors accomplished and what values sustained those accomplishments. A working man became a hero. The hero returned to being a working man. The circle completed itself. That was the American way, the democratic ideal distinguishing America from militaristic societies. Service when needed, humility always, useful work as the highest calling. Colonel James Elms Swett would not have asked for more elaborate tribute than this recounting of his life and service. He was, after all, simply doing his job to the best of his ability, which turned out to be extraordinary.